Hello fellow wand lovers and welcome back to the channel. The Force expansion is finally out, and with it, the Techter expansion is now complete. This brought some minor changes to techniques as well as improvements to Talis. So, let's go over them together, shall we? Thanks to the buffs wand received in October, we want to minimize time spent casting techniques, and maximize time spent using the wand. Ideally, we also want to make the most out of elemental blots without interfering with wand gameplay. If you watched my video on the Techter technique problem, you'll recall that I called techniques not only a DPS negative, but also called the elemental blots not compatible with Techter gameplay. Well, let's examine if that's still the case. Fire techniques saw a few changes. First of all, Foibrand has been buffed to 80 potency. This makes the elemental blot mechanic slightly more desirable. The charged version of Foy was buffed, but the uncharged version remained the same as it was before. This on paper makes both versions nearly equal in damage, but we don't really want to use the charged version regardless. After all, time spent charging techniques is time not spent using wand attacks. Giveaway saw a tiny improvement to its uncharged version, though, it's still slightly weaker than uncharged Foy. With both techniques you want to focus on the uncharged version. Due to this, I recommend going with Type 3 customizations on both techniques, since they reduce the amount of techniques required to activate Foibrand from 6 to 4. A single Revoke Pursuit loop takes about 14 seconds, so we are perfectly able of getting one Foibrand activated in a 60-second window. This 60-second window is important as that is the compound technique cooldown, and Fomelgen gives us a second Foibrand for free. Depending on the encounter, you can also start out by charging Giveaway during the countdown. This will allow you to use Skip Beat immediately, and close the gap between you and the enemy, while also inflicting so much Foibrand that you're only 2 casts away from triggering it. Ice techniques got a few minor adjustments. Barta was buffed by 10 potency. This makes the charged version of Barta and Jabarta identical, in terms of damage. Jabarta on the other hand has received a minor buff to its uncharged version, but it's still lagging behind uncharged Barta a tiny bit. That is not an issue however, because with Type 3 Jabarta, the Ice Element blot finally became playable on Techter. The whole combo now takes roughly 45 seconds, as opposed to the previous 75 seconds, but be warned. The Ice Sigil is very easy to lose since it expires after 15 seconds. I recommend popping the Ice Sigil immediately, which technically reduces the combo further into a 30-second block, but also allows us to use the combo twice between compounds. Lightning techniques were already in a pretty good spot, even on Techter, so the element only saw a few minor improvements. Firstly, you no longer lose Zond Clad if you get staggered during the casting animation. Secondly, Zond and Gazond received a slight buff to their supercharged version, making the elemental blot more desirable than before. There is not much else to say. Our gameplay loop on lightning techniques was already perfect, now it's even better. Wind saw barely any buffs, which is unfortunate, but let's go over them anyway. Gazond saw a tiny potency buff and PP cost reduction. Seeing as Gazond is the single target attack, receiving a buff is definitely beneficial when fighting enemies weak to wind, but the elemental blot is unfortunately still very weak. This will probably be something that gets addressed with Tech Art's customizations. Fortunately, the elemental blot is perfectly usable on Techter without the customization, since we can just string 2 skip beats back to back. And we kind of have to, because the Zond Gale Mark doesn't stick around for too long. Light techniques saw a few interesting changes. Uncharged grants received a slight buff, which is very nice for us since we really like using uncharged techniques. The attack range has been expanded, and the attack activates sooner. This ends up improving the accuracy of grants, which has been one of its biggest issues since light techniques were added to the game. Type 1 grants received a small buff, which only Force players will be able to make use of. Gigrants on the other hand received a buff to its charged version while keeping the uncharged version almost unchanged. This is a nice buff, but Grant's glitter is sadly still not Techter compatible. Though, with the buffs to uncharged grants, and Type 3 Gigrants being a thing, I would argue we don't really need glitter. Both techniques have a place in our toolkit, and the only time I can realistically see us making use of Grant's glitter is when we use Baransian followed up by Revoke Pursuit. Dark techniques were also in a good spot before, so a lot of the changes are quality of life in nature. You no longer lose Megid spheres if you get staggered during the casting animation. Charged Megid, under the Megid sphere influence, was slightly buffed, both in its vanilla and Type 2 version. Gimagid on the other hand had its uncharged version buffed, in order to be more in line with the power of uncharged Megid. Dark Element was already pretty playable on Techter before. Megid spheres don't expire for 20 seconds, so we have plenty of time to do our usual revoke combo. The whole Megid combo also fits nicely into a 60-second time frame, so it perfectly fits in with the Fomelgen cooldown. Finally, let's talk about compound techniques. These saw a 25% buff across the board, which honestly surprised me because I only expected a 20% buff. This is very welcome though, and probably where we will feel the improvements caused by the Force expansion the most. With compound techniques gaining strength, Force subclass is a little bit more desirable than before. It speeds up the compound technique gauge by 30%, and now that compound techniques deal more damage, you can probably imagine how that affects the average DPS. Though, if you're speedrunning content, you will very likely swap subclasses, based on which is best for the encounter, anyway. Speaking of compound techniques, if you watched some of my previous gameplay videos, you might have noticed that I used to pop both elemental blots after a compound technique. Turns out this is a really bad habit us Techter players developed due to Techter just being so unfinished for the longest time. With all the changes that happened to us in the past few months, mathematically speaking, it is not worth going for elemental blots that aren't matching enemy weakness. This in turn means we don't have to use both elements on one weapon palette, allowing us to use both techniques of an element depending on which situation suits them most. It also streamlines our gameplay in general while giving a little bit on the spot decision making. To summarize, a lot of issues Techter had with techniques have been either fixed or improved, thanks to the combined efforts of the Techter and Force expansions. The few issues remaining will likely be taken care of with the next wave of TechArts customizations. Now, let's talk about Talis. Talis received a few really good improvements, but unfortunately, those improvements don't fix the main issues holding it back from being a good main weapon. Let's start with the positives. Talis sign marking accumulation has been increased across the board, and the potency of the mark has been increased. Furthermore, the weapon action now attacks faster, allowing it to shoot more shots than before, which ends up increasing its DPS noticeably. The AoE version of the weapon action has received the most noticeable improvements. Instead of being DPS neutral when used against 3 enemies, and only being usable against 3 enemies, which honestly made it pointless before, it is now DPS positive as long as it hits 2 enemies, and on top of that, the AoE weapon action can attack up to 5 enemies now. Convergence Shot received a sizable buff, which makes redeploying the Talis formation slightly less punishing. Spread Shot on the other hand was sped up, in order to make redeploying techniques slightly less jarring, while also allowing the circular AoE version to slowly build Talis sign marking. Previously the mark was virtually a single target exclusive mechanic, because it just built up so painfully slowly, so that's a really nice addition. But unfortunately that's where my praise ends. Tricky Capacitor wasn't buffed at all, which is a massive disappointment. Step Counter received no potency buffs, keeping its title as the worst counter in the game, and accuracy of converged techniques hasn't been improved whatsoever. This is very unfortunate because fixing these 3 areas would have made Talis competent as a main weapon, but because they went unaddressed, Talis remains the same as it was before, with the benefit that now it's less punishing to play. As it stands, Talis remains a nice subweapon to aid wand and rod gameplay, but I wouldn't recommend it as a main weapon. And that's about it. Kind of a bummer about Talis, but the technique improvements are really good. Techter is finally beginning to feel like a complete class. Though, we'll have to wait for those remaining TechArts customizations for that sweet finishing touch. I hope you found this video informative. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care!